All right. Hello and welcome back, everybody. Today, I do have our friend Lightning here to join us. We also have our good friend, the Statue of Liberty. I will play for you this video on the Statue of Liberty's history. Key things to remember again, she was a gift from the French. She came about in this period after the Civil War. And she also completed in 1886. She's there in her bronze glory before she oxidizes and becomes all green. Right when you have this influx, this massive influx of all these millions and millions of immigrants that are going to be pouring into the United States during this period we call the Gilded Age. So she is integral to this. And there's a poem inscribed on the podium from which she sits that was put on later, I think in, was it 1903? This poem was inscribed, the very famous poem that says, "Give me your poor, your tired, your sick, your huddled masses yearning to be free." She stands as the symbol to greet all immigrants that were coming into the United States at this time period. And I say all, there will be some immigrants, of course, coming from our Canadian border, coming from our Mexican border, and even some that'll be coming through like Angel Island, through the San Francisco Bay, maybe from Asia, Asian immigrants. But most immigrants during this time in the late 1800s will be coming to New York Harbor from places in Europe and new places in Europe, including like Southern and Eastern Europe. So that is a big part of this time period. The term Gilded Age, like I mentioned at the end of our last lecture, is a term coined by the famous American author Mark Twain, or his real name, Samuel Clemens, in his book that he co-authored by the same name, The Gilded Age, A Story of Today. And basically, when something is gilded, that means that it has like a shiny golden veneer, an outside like coating that's really glossy and pretty and gorgeous. But when you scrape beneath the surface, you find that it's covering up something ugly. And that's his metaphor for this time period, that America is going to be building up during this time period, getting really big and having skyscrapers rise up to meet the skies, having railroads, thousands and thousands of miles, they triple every 20 years, connecting everything and everybody. And America's just doing so well on the surface. But when you scrape beneath that surface, you find that there is a lot of troubling aspects. Of course, leftovers from the fall of Reconstruction, we have white supremacy and racism dominating the South with the rise of the Jim Crow laws from the Black Coats. You're going to have in northern cities immense corruption with these large rings, such as the political machines, like the Tweed Ring and Tammany Hall. You're going to have corruption at the national level, like we'll talk about with the Grant administration and many others. And overall, you're going to see many poor people, especially these immigrants I was just mentioning with the Statue of Liberty, being taken advantage of as America industrializes and becomes one of the world's most successful economies. This is the Gilded Age. So rapid industrialization, mass immigration, Native Americans getting slaughtered, America expanding fully from sea to shining sea, the Gilded Age. And so I said it's the time period when we're going to see rapid industrialization. The market revolution, the beginning of the industrialization in the United States, began in the early 1800s, coming over from England. But in, Lightning's getting really into this. She says, "Ooh, Gilded Age, it's so exciting." But in the late 1800s, this is the second industrial revolution in the United States. Why is America going to be so successful? What factors are going to combine to make us one of the most mature industrial economies in the world, able to produce a third of the entire industrial global output? So consider that. What does give America an advantage? And some of the answers, hopefully you've thought of, would include our vast abundance of natural resources. We are a huge nation compared to a lot of those European nations. Like if you want to look at England, where we came from, where we're speaking British, remember 13 original colonies, hopefully you haven't already forgotten about that. It wasn't that long ago that we talked about it. Well, you got an eye bugger. Gross. Sorry, bad habits, cleaning my cat's eyes. Um, so our natural resources, vast natural resources, our size, and the diversity of the geography in our country. The state of Texas that we live in is actually bigger, more lands area than England, than all of Great Britain combined, bigger than France. So that just gives you an idea of the size, the immensity, and the vast natural resources that the U.S. has. Another factor that contributes to our industrial might in the late 1800s is going to be the growing supply of very cheap labor in the form of these nearly 30 million immigrants that are going to be flooding into America's cities. Immigrants will be the cheap labor source needed to fuel this industrial economy. Another factor was the expanding markets for manufactured goods that we're going to possess. The world was becoming more connected because of steamships and new discoveries of land and colonizations. As the world became colonized and more connected, there became more markets for which to sell our stuff to. Um, and so America will be part of this grab for colonies that was taking place. Maybe not in the European sense. This is like the era for the scramble of Africa you probably learned about last year in world history class. But we will be making colonies. We will be eventually taking over Hawaii in the 1890s, and in the Spanish-American War in 1898, we will be acquiring colonies of our own when we defeat Spain. And with these colonies, such as the Philippines that we'll acquire, we will gain footholds into vast new markets, such as China. Okay. Remember also we talked about previously how we had made inroads in the 1850s to trade with Japan with like Commodore Matthew Perry. So that's what we mean by new markets to expand to sell our manufactured goods to, because that can grow your economy too. It's not just being able to make a lot of stuff, it's also being able to sell what you produce. And another factor is the availability of capital for investment. We're going to have a lot of money resources with the banking interest. Remember that Republicans were able to get our financial interests kind of squared away during the Civil War, and then we go back to the gold standard. So we have our money kind of somewhat stabilized at this time period. There will be a lot of debate over what money should be based on in the late 1800s, especially by the 1890s, when we get the rise of a group of farmers. Dun, 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 dun. Get used to that. I'm corny, I know, but it's going to help you remember these guys. They're called the populace, these poor farmers. Get it? They are farmers. I know you've seen the commercial. And then some other factors that can contribute to our industrial might. We have a federal government that, while Congress is mostly in control during this time period, the presidents are going to be taking a back seat, as we saw like with congressional reconstruction. The federal government will be actively promoting industry and agricultural development by enacting high tariffs that protect American industry from foreign competition. Remember, that's the role of a tariff. Um, they'll also be granting land to railroad companies to encourage construction, and out west, as well as contributing to the railroad companies, the federal government will also be using our military, our cavalry, to remove Native Americans from Western lands that were desired by these large agricultural and mining companies. So federal government will be assisting in this transformation as well. So by 1913, like I said, we are pretty impressive. The US is producing 1/3 of the world's industrial outputs, and our country's landscape was changing, and the way people were working was changing as well. Okay. You have by 1880, for the first time ever in our nation's history, a majority of the US workforce, over half, were actually not working on the farms anymore. Remember, when our country began back in the era of colonization and whatnot in the 1600s, pretty much everybody that came over here was going to be working in agriculture. Thomas Jefferson's dream in the 1700s was that every American, every white male American, could have a farm of his own for which to be able to be self-sufficient so that he would not need to rely on anyone else for charity or for work. He would be able to be in charge of his own work, his own destiny. But this traditional dream is kind of, by the end of the Civil War, no longer something that could be obtained. It's obsolete. By 1890, two-thirds of Americans worked for wages rather than owning a farm business or a craft shop. And they're drawn to factories by the promise of employment. A new working class emerged in these late 1800s years. Between 1870 and 1920, in those 50 years, almost 11 million Americans moved away from the farms and into the cities. And you have another 25 million immigrants arriving from overseas, mostly coming into America's cities, again, for the opportunity of those factory jobs. Which is another reason when Mark Twain, talks about uncovering that gilded surface and looking beneath at the corrupt, rotted core of what was happening in America in this time period. You have immigrants and workers in the cities being taken advantage of so much because there was just so many of them. Employers could afford to treat them like machines, easily replaceable, because there were just so many. And you could see in this table right here that the land in farms, the wheat grown, employment, it's all growing from 1870 to 1920 in those 50 years, okay? But look here, percentage of the workforce that's employed in agriculture, it goes down dramatically in those 50 years. And industry is going up quite a bit, okay? Again, the reason for that is mechanization. It's opportunities in the cities. It's the fact you don't need as many people to be farming anymore to produce as much agricultural output. You can produce more crops with less people now because you are going to start to have things like tractors and automatic reapers and other machines that can do the work that farmhands used to. And so those farmhands find themselves without jobs. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to the cities. And that's going to be changing the makeup of our country. We become more urban. We become more like city dwellers. Interestingly, I'll also just point out here, I found this interesting. Life expectancy at birth in 1870, right after the Civil War, was only 42 years. You were only expected to live to about 42 years. That was the average age. In 1900, it was up a little bit, and you can see 1920. If we were to follow this to today, I think the average life expectancy in 2020, minus COVID and all this going on right now, is closer to probably 80 something years, maybe around 80 or 82. And it's interesting, maybe what it could be in 100 years from now. So that's something to think about. Railroads are going to make possible this second industrial revolution that's occurring. Remember, they're being spurred by private investment and massive grants of land and money by the federal, state, and local governments. The numbers of tracks in the United States are going to triple between 1860 and 1880. And then 40 years later, 1920, they have tripled again. So there is hundreds of thousands of miles of track in the United States by the 1920s. And this Gilded Age, which is the late 1800s, we are building those railroads. And they're opening up vast new areas of commercial farming and creating a truly national market for manufactured goods, connecting everything and everybody. If your town, if your city was not on the railroad, it's going to become dried up, what they called a ghost town. Which is a real thing. It's a town that basically becomes abandoned because it wasn't connected. Today, that would be like the towns and cities that were bypassed by the interstates, the interstate highways. If your town or city is not on it, it's pretty isolated. If there's nothing else for it there, it's going to dry up. People are going to move away to a place that is connected, that will have commerce or business taking place. And the railroads during this time period in the Gilded Age, they even reorganized time itself. In 1883, the major railroad companies divided our country into the 4 time zones that we still use today. You could see in this map pictured here, those 4 time zones are the Eastern time zone, the Central time zone, the Mountain Standard time zone for the Rockies, and then the Pacific time zone, like where California is at. So here in Texas, in Waco, we are in Central time. And that's why a lot of those TV shows we watch, if you watch them live instead of on Netflix, which probably not too many of you do anymore, they always say that they air at like 7 p.m. Eastern, which means actually for us, it's a bit later. We have to wait a little bit longer. And then you also have Atlantic time zone, but that's not going to be part of the United States, see, because that's in Canada. There's also, let's see, I think Hawaii is on a different time zone as well. In parts of Alaska, I think Alaska is mostly on Pacific, but so those are the 4 major time zones for our country. And that was for the railroads, basically, because you were having the sun go up and then down. The world is like this. It's why the world is divided into the 24-hour time zones. I know when I lived in England, for instance, it's 8 hours ahead. No, it's 6 hours. Yeah, 6 hours ahead of Texas, of Central Time. I can't remember what the time zone was called there, but that's basically how that works. Okay. Now, some of the inventions that were happening in this Gilded Age are also going to be transforming society, making things easier for people, kind of creating the modern world that we are starting to see. It looks a little bit more familiar. Let me move my picture here so we could see all the inventions. There we go. All right, so the Atlantic cable was completed in 1866, the year after the Civil War ended. This is a cable, you can see on the map here, that's going to connect Canada with England, the British Islands. And really what it does is it connects North America with Europe as far as instantaneous electrical telegraph communication. You can now, from 1866, send telegraph communications instantly from one continent to the other. It is literally a underwater cable that goes from continent to continent. It's pretty amazing. And so that's going to make the world so much smaller place. That will be a key thing later on when we get to like the world wars, that Atlantic cable. You're also going to have, in addition to the telegraph wires, which were so important, remember, during the Civil War for logistics, and like Lincoln, remember, he had his own telegraph, like communications headquarters in the basement of the White House and everything. You're also going to have, by the 1870s, the invention of the actual telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, prolific inventor, amazing inventor. He specialized in a lot of his patents with sound waves. He actually was married to a deaf woman, and this kind of spurred on his interest in assisting people with hearing aids and other things. But it's also why he specialized in sound waves. And so Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. And you could see a picture of one of the early telephones right there. It's pretty simple, but obviously it'll evolve over time. And eventually we will have cellular phones by the 1990s and the 2000s, and then the smartphones like we have today beginning in like the mid 2000s. But yeah, the telephone begins in the 1870s. And that's, it's a big improvement over the telegraph. Before it was beep, 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 and you had to have a telegraph operator decipher what that code meant. Now you can actually have somebody just, hello, what's she saying there? Yeah, I understand you. You can actually talk. The typewriter, pictured right here, is going to allow people to have movable type, like in their own personal homes. They can type out stuff, type out letters. Don't have computers yet. Computers, the very, very first computers, like the Enigma machine, will not be created until the Second World War, used for decoding enemy letters, enemy communication. And then real computers don't actually develop until the Cold War, after World War II, during the space race, like the IBM supercomputer. So we don't have computers yet. No, no, no. But we do have a typewriter, okay? And handheld cameras, like this one pictured right here, you do have photography. Remember, we talked about how they had photography even before the Civil War, how photography was very instrumental during the Civil War. But now you actually have handheld cameras. You'll even have like the Romanov family of Russia in the early 1900s, taking like selfies and stuff, basically the first selfies with these big, cumbersome, awkward handheld cameras. Thomas Edison was probably the most famous inventor of the time period. I say famous, I did not say greatest, because that is up for debate. There was other, of course, very famous inventors like his proteges, Nikola Tesla and Henry Ford and others. But Edison gets the moniker of being the most famous and definitely the most prolific because he set up basically a an invention factory, innovation factory system where he hired a bunch of these really bright young inventors and scientists to work for him. And anything that they created, you know, he'd have a hand in authorizing their experiments and in, you know, helping them patent it. But basically, he got to have the copyright because these inventors worked for him. So yeah, Edison is credited with like over 1,000 patents of inventions that he created, but really he wasn't the creator of these specifically. This was a place he called Menlo Park in New Jersey. But yeah, Edison is credited with developing the phonograph machine, which can play, you know, sound. He's credited with helping the development of the light bulb. Whether or not he created the actual light bulb is up for debate, but he definitely perfected the light bulb. He's credited with motion picture technology and with a system for generating and distributing electrical power. And this is where you get the very famous current wars between his former protege, the Eastern European inventor Nikola Tesla, and Thomas Edison, and basically AC versus DC currents. And they had in this current war basically which one should begin to be used as an energy grid for America's cities. In the war of the currents between Tesla and Edison, Edison basically favored what was called DC currents, DC electricity or direct current electricity. This is where the electricity only runs one way, direct current. Tesla favored AC electricity or alternating current electricity, where it could alternate directions at a certain speed or even go up or down in voltage, alternating. DC was safer and more direct, or so it was said, because it did not alternate like that. And so both Edison and Tesla compete over what electricity source cities would use, DC for Edison or AC for Tesla. And during the current wars, because Edison had already kind of invested so much in DC current, he led a propaganda campaign to basically make people believe that AC current was too wild and unpredictable and dangerous to be used for a large city grid for electricity. And in his propaganda campaign, Edison actually had stray animals be publicly electrocuted by AC currents to show how dangerous they were. In one famous instance, he even had a live elephant electrocuted in front of an audience to show the dangers of AC currents. Now, obviously, if you electrocute anything, it's going to die. And so this was massive propaganda. Eventually, this city of Buffalo, New York, is going to use AC currents from Tesla, however, from Niagara Falls. And when this works, pretty much most people will begin by the late 1800s to use the AC currents because you're able to more easily have higher voltages using AC currents. DC is still used, however, in a lot of things such as fuel cells or in electric cars today. And so who won the current war? both sides really, because we got electricity, and electricity is so important for this industrial age. It's going to transform the way people lived and worked in good ways and in bad ways, because hey, everything that we use today basically runs off electricity, right? But it also means that we end up working a lot longer than we normally would have. Think about in factories that had previously been run using, not electricity. They could basically only operate during the daytime. Now they can operate way into the night hours, and they will because of electricity. So you begin to have the electric grids, mostly thanks to Thomas Edison, but don't forget Nikola Tesla as well. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there for the end of our first lecture on the Gilded Age. When we come back next time, we will be talking about competition and consolidation, the beginning of the monopolies and the monopolists, the men known as either captains of industry or as the malicious, evil robber barons. Thank you guys, and I will talk to you later. Bye.